There is something the Holy Spirit wants many believers to understand, and until this truth is recognized, many will continue wondering why prayer flows easily in one place, yet becomes strangely difficult in another. Many people assume the problem is within themselves. They think, perhaps I am tired, perhaps my faith is weak, perhaps I am distracted. But sometimes the struggle has very little to do with you at all. The truth is that spiritual atmospheres are not the same everywhere. Just as the natural world has climates, places that are warm, cold, peaceful, or stormy, the spiritual world also carries atmospheres. Some places are filled with a sense of peace. The moment you enter, you may walk into a room and immediately feel calm, focused, and drawn toward God. Prayer becomes natural there. Words come easily. Worship flows from your heart. It feels almost effortless to lift your spirit toward heaven. But then there are other places. You may enter them and suddenly your mind feels scattered. Your heart feels heavy. Prayer becomes difficult to concentrate on. Even when you try to focus on God, something seems to press against your spirit. And many believers do not understand why this happens. You see, every place carries a spiritual environment that has been shaped over time. Homes, buildings, and even entire areas can develop atmospheres influenced by what consistently happens there. When a place has been filled with worship, prayer, love, and the presence of God, it often becomes easier for others to pray there as well. There is a sense of spiritual openness, a welcoming presence that draws hearts toward the Lord. But the opposite can also be true. When a place has been filled with anger, conflict, sinful behavior, or spiritual darkness over long periods of time, it can create a spiritual heaviness. People may not see it with their natural eyes, but the Spirit can feel it. And when a believer steps into that environment, something within them senses that difference immediately. This is one of the quiet ways the Holy Spirit works within the life of a believer. The closer you walk with God, the more sensitive your spirit becomes to spiritual atmospheres. It is not something that can always be explained logically. You simply know that something feels different. There are places where you feel drawn to pray the moment you arrive. It may be a quiet room, a church sanctuary, or even a simple corner of your home where you have spent time seeking God. The moment you step there, your spirit recognizes it. Prayer flows easily because that environment has been touched repeatedly by the presence of God. But then there are places where prayer feels strangely resisted. You try to focus, but your thoughts wander. You try to worship, but your heart feels unsettled. And many believers mistakenly blame themselves, not realizing that the atmosphere around them may be influencing what they are experiencing. The Holy Spirit does not reveal this to create fear. He reveals it to create understanding. When you begin to recognize that spiritual atmospheres exist, something changes in the way you approach prayer. You begin to realize that prayer is not only a personal act, it is also a spiritual engagement within environments that are either open to God's presence or resisting it. And this is why the Holy Spirit gently teaches believers to discern the atmosphere around them. Because sometimes the struggle you feel in prayer is not weakness. Sometimes it is awareness. There is another truth the Holy Spirit gently reveals when believers begin to notice that prayer becomes difficult in certain places. Sometimes the struggle is not simply about atmosphere. It is about resistance, real spiritual resistance. Prayer is never a small thing in the spirit realm. When a believer begins to pray, something powerful begins to happen. Prayer invites the authority of God into situations. Prayer opens the door for heaven to move. Prayer pushes back darkness and releases light. And because of that, the enemy never remains passive when a believer truly begins to pray. Many people imagine spiritual battles as dramatic or visible events, but often they are much quieter than that. Sometimes the battle shows itself through distraction. Sometimes through sudden heaviness. Sometimes through an unexplainable lack of focus the moment you begin to seek God. You may have experienced this before without even recognizing what was happening. Perhaps you sat down to pray and felt ready, peaceful, determined. But within moments, your thoughts began to wander. Your mind filled with random concerns. Your attention shifted from God to everything else around you. And you wondered, why is this suddenly so difficult? It is because prayer is not just a conversation, it is a confrontation. When a believer prays, they are stepping into spiritual authority, whether they realize it or not. They are inviting God's presence, God's will, and God's power into the situation. And the enemy understands something many believers forget. Prayer changes things. So there are moments when the struggle you feel while trying to pray is actually evidence that something in the spirit realm is resisting what you are doing. The enemy does not fear casual words. He does not fear routine religious activity. But he recognizes the danger of a believer who is truly connecting with God. Because when a believer prays with faith, clarity, and surrender, heaven begins to respond. That is why resistance often appears at the very moment someone begins to pray seriously. You may feel sudden tiredness even though you were not tired before. You may feel an unusual pressure in your thoughts. You may feel a strange heaviness settle into the atmosphere around you. None of these things are random. They are subtle attempts to interrupt the connection between the believer and God. But here is the beautiful thing the Holy Spirit wants every believer to understand. Resistance in prayer is not a sign that you should stop. It is often a sign that what you are doing matters deeply. When prayer begins to push against unseen darkness, the enemy attempts to create discouragement. If he can convince a believer that the struggle means they are failing, then he has already weakened their persistence. But the Holy Spirit reveals the truth. The struggle is not proof of weakness. It is proof that something significant is happening. And when believers understand this, their perspective changes completely. Instead of withdrawing from prayer when it becomes difficult, they press deeper. Instead of feeling discouraged, they recognize that prayer is touching something in the unseen world. The enemy hopes believers will stop praying when resistance appears. But the Holy Spirit teaches believers to recognize resistance for what it truly is. And when a believer continues to pray in the middle of that resistance, something begins to shift in the spirit realm. Because darkness can only push back for so long when someone refuses to stop calling on the name of the Lord. And that is when the battle begins to turn. There is something else the Holy Spirit quietly reveals when believers begin to understand why prayer becomes difficult in certain places. Sometimes the struggle is not only about resistance in the spirit realm, but about influences that quietly surround us without being noticed. Many people think distractions are simply a normal part of life, but the truth is that some environments are filled with influences that constantly pull the heart and mind away from God. You may have experienced moments when you began to pray with sincerity, yet almost immediately your attention was pulled in many different directions. Your thoughts began racing. Your mind moved from one concern to another. Instead of focusing on the presence of God, you found yourself thinking about problems, responsibilities, memories, or even things that had nothing to do with the moment. It can feel as though something is constantly interrupting the quiet place where prayer is meant to happen. And the Holy Spirit wants believers to understand that environments can carry more than what we see with our natural eyes. Certain places are filled with noise, tension, and emotional pressure that affect the inner life of the soul. In those places, the mind struggles to become still, and the heart finds it difficult to enter into deep communion with God. When an environment is filled with constant negativity, anxiety, conflict, or spiritual darkness, it begins to influence the thoughts of the people who remain there. Over time, it creates a kind of mental and emotional turbulence. It becomes difficult to find peace. It becomes difficult to quiet the mind. And prayer requires a heart that is able to turn its full attention toward the Lord. The enemy understands this very well. He does not always attack believers with obvious or dramatic opposition. Often, he simply fills environments with enough distraction to weaken spiritual focus. If a believer can be kept mentally scattered, emotionally overwhelmed, or constantly occupied with lesser things, then prayer slowly loses its depth. But the Holy Spirit does something remarkable for those who walk closely with God. He begins to reveal these influences. There are moments when you may step into a place and immediately feel that your mind is becoming restless. You may notice that your thoughts become unusually unsettled. It may feel difficult to gather your focus and direct it toward God. This is not always coincidence. The Holy Spirit often allows believers to sense when something around them is interfering with spiritual clarity. It is part of how He teaches discernment. As believers grow in their relationship with God, they begin to recognize that not every thought entering their mind belongs to them. Not every feeling comes from their own heart. Some environments feed distraction in subtle ways. Noise, tension, negative conversations, spiritual emptiness. These things create conditions where it becomes harder to center the heart on God. But the purpose of this revelation is not to discourage believers. It is to help them guard their inner life. When the Holy Spirit reveals that an environment is influencing your focus, He is also inviting you to become intentional about protecting your spirit. Prayer may require stepping away from certain places. It may require creating quiet spaces where the presence of God can be welcomed without constant interference. Over time, believers learn that prayer flourishes best in environments where peace is protected and the heart is able to listen. The Holy Spirit leads them to places where their minds can become still and their spirits can respond freely to the presence of God. Because when the noise fades and the distractions lose their power, something beautiful begins to happen. The voice of God becomes easier to hear. There is a beautiful and often misunderstood part of the believer's walk with God, and it is this: the human spirit, when it is surrendered to the Holy Spirit, becomes sensitive to things that cannot be seen with natural eyes. Many people think that spiritual sensitivity is something mysterious or unusual, but in truth it is simply the result of closeness with God. When a person spends time in prayer, in worship, and in quiet fellowship with the Lord, something begins to awaken within their spirit. They begin to perceive things differently. Situations that once seemed normal suddenly feel different. Places that once felt comfortable may begin to feel unsettled. And often they cannot explain why. You may have walked into a room before and suddenly felt an unexplainable heaviness. Nothing looked different. Nothing seemed outwardly wrong. Yet something within you felt uncomfortable, almost as if your spirit was quietly warning you that something about the environment was not right. Many people ignore that feeling because they think it is simply emotion. But very often it is something deeper. It is the Holy Spirit allowing your spirit to sense what your natural eyes cannot see. The closer a believer walks with God, the more their inner life becomes aware of spiritual conditions. It is similar to how a person becomes sensitive to changes in the weather. Someone who has lived near the sea for many years can sense when a storm is coming long before it appears on the horizon. They feel the change in the air. They recognize the shift in the atmosphere. In the same way, the Holy Spirit teaches believers to recognize spiritual shifts in environments around them. There are places where you may feel peace the moment you arrive. Your heart becomes calm, your thoughts settle. It becomes easy to pray, easy to worship, easy to turn your attention toward God. That peace is not imagined. It is often the result of an atmosphere where the presence of God has been welcomed again and again. But there are also places where your spirit becomes restless. You may try to pray, but something feels unsettled. You may attempt to focus, yet your heart feels uneasy. Sometimes there is a quiet discomfort that you cannot explain. This sensitivity is not meant to frighten believers. It is meant to guide them. The Holy Spirit is a gentle teacher. He does not shout or force his direction upon us. Instead, he often speaks through quiet impressions within the spirit. A sense of peace may mean you are in the right place. A sense of heaviness may be a signal that something is spiritually wrong in that environment. And many believers experience this without realizing that it is the Holy Spirit guiding them. They think, why do I feel this way here? Why is it easy to pray in one place but difficult in another? Why does my spirit feel calm in one environment but uneasy in another? The answer is that your spirit is learning to recognize what your eyes cannot see. This sensitivity grows stronger the more closely a believer walks with God. The Holy Spirit begins to sharpen their discernment. Over time, they learn to trust those inner impressions. They learn that when their spirit feels peace, it is often because the presence of God is near. And when their spirit feels troubled, it may be because something in the spiritual atmosphere is not aligned with God's presence. And this awareness becomes an important protection for the believer's spiritual life. Because when your spirit learns to recognize what cannot be seen, you begin to understand something very powerful. Your spirit was never meant to walk blindly through this world. There is another truth the Holy Spirit gently reveals as believers grow in their understanding of spiritual atmospheres. Places do not remain untouched by what happens within them. Just as memories can linger in the human heart, the history of a place can influence the spiritual atmosphere that surrounds it. Many people think of buildings and locations as nothing more than physical structures. Walls, floors, rooms, streets, simply materials and space. But life happens inside those spaces. Words are spoken there. Decisions are made there. Joy, pain, worship, anger, love and sin all unfold within those environments. And over time, these things can leave a kind of spiritual imprint. You may have entered a place before and immediately felt a strange heaviness without knowing why. Nothing outwardly appeared wrong. The room looked ordinary. People around you may have seemed perfectly comfortable, yet something within your spirit felt unsettled, as though the atmosphere carried a weight that could not easily be explained. Often believers wonder why this happens. They question themselves. They assume they are imagining something. But sometimes the Holy Spirit is allowing them to sense something connected to the spiritual history of that place. Think about the opposite for a moment. There are places where prayer has been offered for years. There are homes where families have worshipped together, where the name of God has been honored day after day. When you step into those environments, there is often a noticeable peace. Something about the atmosphere feels welcoming, calm, and open to the presence of God. This is not coincidence. It is the result of what has consistently happened there. When people invite God into a place again and again through prayer, worship, and faith, that environment begins to reflect it. The presence of God fills that space with peace, and others who enter it often feel drawn toward prayer without even realizing why. But the opposite can also happen. Places where constant anger, conflict, dishonesty, or sinful behavior have dominated over long periods of time can develop a heavy spiritual atmosphere. The human eye may not see it, but the spirit can feel it, and when a believer attempts to pray in that environment, something within them senses the resistance that has built up there. This is why prayer sometimes feels difficult in certain places. It is not always because the believer is weak. It may be because the environment itself carries the residue of spiritual darkness from its past. The Holy Spirit does not reveal this to create fear or suspicion about every place we enter. His purpose is not to make believers anxious about their surroundings. Instead, he reveals these things so that believers understand the spiritual reality they are stepping into. When you recognize that places can carry spiritual history, it changes the way you approach prayer. Instead of becoming discouraged when prayer feels difficult, you begin to understand that you may be stepping into an environment that has long been untouched by God's presence. And this realization brings a new perspective. Instead of withdrawing, the believer begins to pray with greater purpose. Instead of being intimidated by the heaviness of a place, they recognize that prayer is exactly what that environment needs. Because the presence of God has the power to transform any atmosphere, no matter what history it carries. Darkness may linger for a long time in a place where God has not been welcomed. But the moment sincere prayer begins to rise, something begins to change. Because no history of darkness is stronger than the presence of God. And this brings us to something deeply encouraging, that the Holy Spirit wants every believer to understand. If you have ever struggled to pray in certain places, if you have felt heaviness, distraction, resistance, or an unsettling atmosphere, none of these things mean that prayer is powerless there. In fact, they often mean the opposite. The Holy Spirit does not reveal these things simply so believers can recognize them. He reveals them so believers will understand the authority they carry when they pray. Many people think they must escape difficult environments in order to experience God's presence. They believe prayer can only happen in perfect conditions, in quiet places, in peaceful atmospheres where everything feels right. And yes, there are moments when the Holy Spirit leads us into quiet spaces where our hearts can rest and listen to God. Those moments are precious. But the power of prayer is not limited to peaceful places. The Holy Spirit teaches believers something far greater. The presence of God can be invited into any place. When a believer begins to pray with faith, something begins to shift in the unseen realm. Prayer is not simply words spoken into the air. Prayer carries authority. Prayer carries the presence of God. And when the presence of God enters an environment, darkness cannot remain the same. You may walk into a place where the atmosphere feels heavy. You may feel resistance when you try to pray. Your mind may struggle to focus, and your spirit may sense that something is wrong. But this is the very moment when the Holy Spirit begins to teach believers how to stand firm. Instead of retreating, the believer begins to worship. Instead of becoming discouraged, they call upon the name of the Lord. Instead of allowing the atmosphere to control their spirit, they invite the Spirit of God to take control of the atmosphere. This is where persistence in prayer becomes powerful. There are moments when prayer may feel like pushing against something unseen. Words may come slowly at first. The atmosphere may still feel heavy. But the believer who continues to pray begins to notice something remarkable. Little by little, the heaviness begins to lift. The mind becomes clearer. Peace begins to settle, where tension once existed. The presence of God is beginning to change the environment. You see, the Holy Spirit does not only reveal spiritual conditions, He empowers believers to overcome them. Through faith, worship, and persistent prayer, believers carry the authority to invite God's presence into places where it has long been absent. A home filled with conflict can become a home filled with peace when prayer begins to rise there. A room once filled with tension can become a place of worship when someone consistently invites the presence of God into it. Even environments that once felt spiritually dark can begin to change when believers refuse to stop praying. This is why the Holy Spirit teaches believers not to be intimidated by difficult atmospheres. Instead, He teaches them to understand the power they carry when they pray in the name of the Lord. The enemy may try to create resistance, distraction, or heaviness, but none of these things are stronger than the presence of God. And when a believer continues to pray with faith, even in places where prayer once felt difficult, something begins to happen that cannot be explained by human strength alone. The atmosphere begins to change. Because when the Holy Spirit is welcomed, no place remains the same.